My name is Serena Walsh. I'm 32 years old, and I want to tell you about the day I sat in a lawyer's office after my uncle's funeral and heard my name read from a document that had been changed 7 days before he died. Not added, removed. I want to start where this actually starts, because the ending only makes sense if you understand what came before it. And what came before it was 17 years of a relationship I believed in completely. My uncle Robert was my father's younger brother. He never married, never had children, lived alone in a house outside of Knoxville that he'd bought in his 40s with money he'd saved carefully over a career in civil engineering. He was precise and quiet and funny in a dry way that snuck up on you, the kind of man who said very little but meant everything he said, which made you pay attention when he spoke. My father died when I was 13. Car accident, winter road, nothing dramatic about the circumstances except that he was there and then he wasn't. Robert stepped in the way some people do in a crisis, not loudly, not with grand gestures, but steadily, reliably, in the way of someone who understands that showing up consistently over years matters more than any single dramatic act of love. He came to my school events. He called on my birthday without fail. When I got into college, he drove 4 hours to help me move in and then took me out for dinner, and told me, in the plain-spoken way he had, that my father would have been proud and that he intended to be there for everything my father was going to miss. I believed him. I had every reason to believe him. He was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia when I was 27. I was living in Charlotte by then, working in pharmaceutical research, which meant I understood more about what AML meant than most people would have. I understood the treatment protocols, the survival statistics, the weight of the word relapsed when it appeared in a medical chart. His oncologist told him early on that a bone marrow transplant was his best option if initial chemotherapy achieved remission. That a matched donor, if one could be found, would give him the strongest chance of long-term survival. The donor registry search came up empty. His care team expanded the search to family members. I got tested without hesitation. I didn't discuss it with anyone beforehand, didn't weigh it as a decision that required extended deliberation. Robert had shown up for me for 17 years without being asked. The idea that I might be able to give him a chance at life, and would choose not to try, was simply not a thought I was capable of having. I was a match. Not a partial match, nor a close enough match that the team was cautiously optimistic. A strong, highly compatible match that Robert's oncologist described, with visible relief, as the kind of result they hoped for and rarely got from family donors. The donation process took several months from initial testing to the... There were more tests, medical clearances, a psychological evaluation, a series of injections to stimulate my bone marrow production in the weeks before collection. The injections caused bone pain, a deep, aching pressure that felt like something wrong happening inside my skeleton, which technically it was, my body producing cells faster than it was designed to. I worked through it. I didn't tell Robert how uncomfortable it was because I didn't want him to feel guilty about something neither of us had chosen. The collection procedure itself was done under general anesthesia. I was in the hospital for one night. Recovery took about 2 weeks before I felt fully like myself again, tired in a way that went bone deep, moving more carefully than usual, aware of my body in a way I rarely was before that experience. Robert's transplant happened. His body accepted the graft. His oncologist used the word encouraging. His blood work improved. For about 14 months after the transplant, things looked genuinely hopeful. During those 14 months, Robert and I talked more than we ever had. He called me more often, asked more questions about my life, seemed newly interested in the details of my days in a way that felt like a man who had been reminded forcefully that time was not guaranteed. We talked about my work, about his garden, about the book he was reading, about a trip he wanted to take to Ireland if he stayed well. He told me once during one of those calls that he didn't know how to thank me for what I'd done. I told him he didn't have to. He said that wasn't the kind of thing you just let sit without acknowledgement, that he was going to make sure I knew how much it mattered to him. I told him I already knew. I wasn't thinking about money or inheritance or what happened to his house and his savings when he was gone. I was thinking about my uncle, who had driven 4 hours to help me move into a college dormitory, telling me that my contribution to his survival mattered to him. That was enough. That was more than enough. The leukemia came back 18 months after the transplant. Second relapse after bone marrow transplant is, in most cases, a different kind of conversation. The options narrow significantly. The language shifts from treatment to management, from cure to quality of life. Robert's oncologist was honest with him, and with Robert's permission, honest with me when I called to ask what we were looking at. We were looking at months, not years. Robert chose to stop aggressive treatment and move to palliative care. He made that decision clearly, deliberately, without what I read as significant ambivalence. He was 63 years old, he had fought hard, and he was tired in a way that chemotherapy wasn't going to fix. I respected that decision even though it was painful to accept. He moved to a hospice facility in October. I took 2 weeks off work and drove to Knoxville to be with him. I want to describe those 2 weeks carefully because they matter to what came after. Robert was lucid for most of that time. Tired, diminished physically, but mentally present in a way I was grateful for, able to have real conversations, to tell stories, to make the dry, quiet jokes that had always been his signature. We watched football games together. I read to him in the evenings from a novel he'd started and couldn't hold anymore. His sister Patricia, my aunt, my father's and Robert's sister, visited twice during that period, both times briefly. She lived in Knoxville, 40 minutes from the hospice, but her visits were short and her presence felt somehow performative in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Patricia had always occupied a complicated position in the family. She and Robert had a functional but not particularly warm relationship. They were polite to each other at holidays, called occasionally, maintained the surface structure of siblinghood without much depth underneath it. I had never fully understood what had created that distance. Robert didn't talk about it, and I had learned not to push on topics he kept closed. During those 2 weeks, I noticed that Patricia's visits, brief as they were, seemed to leave Robert slightly unsettled in a way that our time together did not. He would be quieter after she left, more withdrawn. I asked him once gently if everything was okay with Patricia. He said yes. He said it in the tone he used when he meant something closer to it's complicated, and I don't want to get into it. I let it go. Robert died on a Thursday morning in November, quietly, in the way hospice deaths often go when someone has made peace with what's coming. I was not in the room. I had stepped out to get coffee about 20 minutes before the nurse called me back. That timing is something I have had to make my peace with, the particular grief of almost being there. The funeral was the following Monday. Small, simple, the way Robert would have wanted it, a chapel service, a graveside burial, lunch afterward at a restaurant he'd liked in Knoxville. Patricia organized most of it, efficiently and without much consultation with me, which I attributed to geography and practicality rather than anything more deliberate. The reading of the will was scheduled for the Wednesday after the funeral, at the office of Robert's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch who had handled Robert's legal affairs for many years. I drove to Gerald's office on Wednesday morning without any particular anxiety. Robert had mentioned his will to me once, years earlier, in the context of making sure his affairs were in order, a brief, practical conversation where he'd said he intended to leave the house and his savings to the people who mattered most to him, and that I was among them. He hadn't gone into specifics. I hadn't asked for any. It had felt like a conversation about care and intention rather than about money. Gerald's office was small and orderly, the kind of space that communicates competence through its very tidiness. Patricia was already there when I arrived, sitting in one of the 2 chairs across from Gerald's desk. She looked up when I came in and nodded, something in her expression that I registered without fully processing. Gerald waited until we were both settled. He opened a folder. He read through the standard legal framing, the identification of the testator, the date. The date of execution was 7 days before Robert died. I remember registering that date and thinking briefly that it seemed close, and then letting it go, because people often updated their wills during terminal illness, making sure everything was properly arranged before they couldn't anymore. Gerald read through the document. The house went to Patricia. The savings account approximately $340,000, money Robert had accumulated carefully. A collection of items including his engineering library, his record collection, and a watch that had belonged to our grandfather went to Patricia. There was a small bequest to a conservation charity Robert had supported for years. There was a bequest to a former colleague he'd stayed close with. My name appeared once in the document, in a section near the end, bequeathing me a specific item, a framed photograph of my father and Robert as children, standing in front of their one photograph. I sat in that chair and heard my name and the photograph and nothing else, and I felt the room tilt in a way that had nothing to do with the air and the space. Gerald finished reading. He set the document down. He looked at both of us with the careful neutrality of a man who had seen many readings of many wills and understood that his job in this moment was precision, not comfort. Patricia said something, I don't remember what exactly, something about being grateful, something that had the quality of words prepared in advance. I said nothing. I drove back to my hotel and sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand what I had just heard. I want to be precise about what I felt in those hours, because I think it would be easy to assume that my primary emotion was grief about money, about inheritance, about what I did or didn't receive from my uncle. That wasn't it. The money mattered, but it wasn't the thing that sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't move. What sat there was the photograph, one photograph. In a will that had been updated 7 days before he died, that left everything of substance to a sister he had never been particularly close to. Robert had looked at the sum of our relationship, 17 years, my father's death, 4 hours in a moving van, a bone marrow donation that had bought him 18 additional months of life, and decided that what I deserved from his estate was a photograph. I called a friend that evening. Not to ask for advice, just to talk to someone who knew me, who could hear what I was saying and tell me I wasn't imagining what it meant. She listened to the whole thing and was very quiet for a moment afterward. Then she asked me something that hadn't yet occurred to me. Do you know if Robert actually wrote that will himself, or if someone helped him? I sat with that question for a long time. The following morning I called Gerald Fitch's office and asked to speak with him. His assistant put me through after a brief hold. I asked Gerald as clearly and calmly as I could manage whether he had met with Robert in person to execute the revised will, or whether the changes had been communicated through a third party. There was a pause on Gerald's end. He said he had met with Robert in person. He said Robert had been lucid and had communicated clearly. He said the changes to the document had been Robert's explicit instructions. I asked him whether anyone else had been present at that meeting. Another pause. He said Patricia had accompanied Robert to the appointment, as Robert had difficulty with transportation at that stage of his illness. Patricia had been in the room when Robert revised his will to remove me from it and leave everything to her. I want to be careful here about what I can say with certainty and what I can only suspect, because they are not the same thing, and I think the distinction matters. What I know for certain is that Robert revised his will 7 days before he died, during a period when he was physically weakened and reliant on others for transportation and daily care. I know that the person who accompanied him to that appointment was the primary beneficiary of the revised will. I know that the revision removed me, the person who had donated bone marrow to keep him alive, and left me a single photograph. What I cannot say with certainty is what happened in that room between Patricia and Robert in the weeks before he died, what was said, what pressure, if any, was applied, what version of events about me or about Patricia's own caregiving contributions he may have been given. What I can say is that it didn't fit. It didn't fit the man who had called me every birthday for 17 years. It didn't fit the conversations we'd had during those 14 good months after the transplant, the calls about Ireland and books and my work. It didn't fit the man who had told me he didn't know how to thank me and that he was going to make sure I knew what my donation meant to him. People change their minds. People make unexpected decisions at the end of their lives. I know this. I have made my peace over the months since Robert died, with the possibility that his decision was entirely his own and reflected something I simply didn't understand about his inner life or his relationship with Patricia. But I also contacted an attorney. Her name was Margaret Cho, a probate specialist in Nashville who a colleague recommended. I met with her 6 weeks after the funeral, bringing everything I had, a timeline of my relationship with Robert, documentation of my bone marrow donation including medical records and hospital correspondence, notes from the calls I'd had with Robert during his final months, and what information I had about the circumstances of the will revision. Margaret listened carefully. She asked several questions, including whether I had any written communication from Robert that indicated his intentions regarding his estate. I went back through years of emails. I found one from 3 years earlier, sent after I'd visited Robert for Thanksgiving, that read in part, "I want you to know that I think about your future often and I intend to make sure you're taken care of when I'm gone. You've been more of a daughter to me than I probably ever told you, and that matters to how I'm thinking about things." Margaret read that email twice. She said it wasn't a legally binding document. She said it didn't constitute a promise that could be enforced as a contract. But she said that combined with the circumstances of the revision, the timing, the presence of the sole beneficiary during the signing, the degree of change from what appeared to be a prior understanding, there might be grounds to challenge the will on the basis of undue influence. Undue influence, she explained, is a legal concept that applies when a testator makes changes to their estate documents as a result of pressure, manipulation, or coercion from someone who stands to benefit from those changes, particularly when the testator is in a vulnerable physical or mental state. The challenge would be difficult. It would require demonstrating not just that the outcome seemed unfair, but that Robert's decision had been actively shaped by someone else's interference rather than his own free will. I sat across from Margaret and thought about Patricia's short visits that left Robert unsettled. I thought about the look on Patricia's face when I arrived at Gerald's office on Wednesday morning, not surprise, not grief, but something that looked more like the expression of someone who already knew exactly what was in the document. I thought about Robert saying it's complicated in a tone that meant he didn't want to get into it. I decided to proceed. The challenge process took 8 months. Margaret subpoenaed Gerald's records of the will revision meeting. She obtained Robert's medical records from the hospice facility covering the weeks before his death. She interviewed 2 hospice nurses who had regular contact with Robert during his final weeks. Nurses who, as it turned out, had observations they were willing to share about the dynamics of Robert's visitors and his demeanor after certain visits. One of those nurses, a woman named Diane who had worked in hospice care for 20 years, provided a written statement describing a conversation she had overheard between Patricia and Robert approximately 10 days before his death. She had not thought much of it at the time, she said, because family conversations around end-of-life care were often emotional and complex, and it was not her place to intervene in private family matters. But she remembered it clearly enough to describe it in some detail. Patricia had been telling Robert that I had only agreed to donate bone marrow because I expected something significant in return, that I had made comments to family members about his estate, that my motivations for helping him had never been purely about love or family obligation. None of that was true, not a word of it. I had never made any such comments to family members or to anyone else. The idea that I had calculated my bone marrow donation as a financial investment was so far from my actual experience of that decision that reading Diane's account of Patricia's words felt like reading about a stranger. But Robert, in a hospice bed at the end of his life, reliant on his sister for transportation and daily visits, weakened and frightened and perhaps more susceptible to suggestion than he would have been at full strength. Robert had apparently believed it, or believed enough of it to revise his will 7 days before he died. Margaret presented this evidence in probate court. Patricia's attorney argued that Robert had been of sound mind at the time of the revision, which the medical records largely supported. His cognitive function had remained reasonably intact until very close to the end. She argued that Robert had every legal right to revise his will as he saw fit, and that Diane's account of one overheard conversation was insufficient to establish undue influence. The judge agreed that cognitive competence alone was not the standard. The question was whether Robert's decision had been the product of his own unencumbered judgment, or whether it had been materially shaped by false information provided by someone who stood to benefit from the change. The ruling came on a Friday afternoon in July. The judge found sufficient evidence of undue influence to invalidate the revised will. The estate reverted to the prior version of Robert's will, a document Gerald located in his records that predated the revision by 2 years, in which the estate had been divided, with the house going to Patricia and the financial assets split between Patricia, myself, and the conservation charity Robert had supported. It wasn't the photograph. It was $170,000, and the knowledge that what Robert had actually intended, before someone told him a lie about my motivations, had been to take care of me the way he'd always said he would. Patricia did not speak to me after the ruling. My mother, who had quietly supported my decision to challenge the will without knowing whether it would succeed, called me that evening and we stayed on the phone for almost an hour, not saying very much. I thought about Robert during that call, about Ireland, which he never got to, about the record collection that went to Patricia and that I hope she actually listens to, about the photograph of my father and Robert as children that sits on my dresser now, the one thing from the revised will that I kept, because it was the one thing in that document that still felt true. I am 32 years old. I have a settlement that took 8 months and more emotional energy than I can fully. I have an aunt I will not see again. I have a photograph of 2 boys standing in front of their childhood home, one of whom became my father and one of whom drove 4 hours to help me move into a college dormitory when I was 18. I would give him the bone marrow again. Every injection, every week of recovery, every day of bone pain. Not because of what he left me, because of who he was before someone told him a story that wasn't true about who I was. The one who called every birthday. The one who said he intended to make sure I knew what my donation meant to him. He meant it when he said it. I have to believe that. I do believe that. And sometimes when the legal system works the way it's supposed to, the truth of who someone actually was gets to be the last word after all.